We are very happy to have with us this evening Dr. Gregory Bush and White Sand, Black Beach. In May 1945, activists staged a wade-in at a whites-only beach in Miami, protesting the Jim Crow-era laws that denied blacks access to recreational waterfront areas. Pressured by protesters in this first post-war civil rights demonstration, the Dade County Commission ultimately designated the difficult-to-access Virginia Key as a beach for African Americans. The beach became vitally important to the community, offering a place to congregate with family and friends and to enjoy the natural wonders of the area. It was also a tangible victory in the continuing struggle for civil rights in public space. In White Sand, Black Beach, historian and longtime Miami activist Gregory Bush recounts the unique story of the current state of the public waterfront in Miami. He seeks to shift the local political divisions beyond established interest groups and neoliberalism to a broader vision that simplifies human needs and reconnects people to fundamental values such as health. A place of fellowship, relaxation, and interaction with nature, this beach, Bush argues, offers a common ground of hope for a better future. Gregory Bush is the director of the Institute for Public History at the University of Miami and associate professor of history. Professor Bush is also the author of Lord of Attention, Gerald Stanley Lee and the Crowd Metaphor in Industrializing America. It won the Tabot Prize in 1997 for Best Book in Florida History from the Florida Historical Society. Bush is one of the founders of the Florida Moving Image Archive, the former editor of Film and History, and has been involved in assisting, reviewing, and completing numerous documentary projects, including Patriotic Parades, Wartime Miami, 1898 to 1945, as well as a documentary about the aforementioned Virginia Key Beach. Please give him a nice Books and Books welcome, Dr. Gregory Bush.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I'm happy to take questions afterwards. I first wrestled with aspects of the shift from early American values to modernity in my first book, which is here. It's called Lord of Attention. They have some copies of it outside. And that looked at changing models of heroes and what I identified as the crowd metaphor in industrializing America. I was in particular looking at early notions of mass persuasion and advertising, public relations, fear of anarchy, and deference to men of great wealth. I believe that book in some ways speaks to what I will call the perverse candidacy of Donald Trump from the long forgotten perspective of the progressive era. So I tend to think that, frankly, it resonates in our time, at least to me. Another older book of mine that actually got the title wrong is this one that Arva Parks and I did with Laura Pincus 20 years ago now, right? Documentary history of Miami. That's the one that won the Tabot Prize back then. This new book called White Sand, Black Beach is about land over time and the sea around us along the Miami waterfront. It's about the politics of gaining access to the public beach at Virginia Key by African Americans, notably following the first, again, post-war civil rights demonstration, albeit a very small one, in May of 1945 at Hallover Beach, not at Virginia Key Beach. And it's about the erosion of public space in our time and the struggle to create a political coalition and an alternative cultural ethos about the value of the natural world, as was mentioned before. Thus, to some degree, it also charts some of my own reflections on civic activism over the number of years and public cynicism in our time, because I generally think we live in an incredible degree of cynical times, which is a problem in and of itself. Reflecting selective stories in context about the African American experience in Miami, the role of the news media, the power of big money and lobbying, I also underscore the continuing political and developmental impact of what I call culture of spectacle, which Miami is in many ways. I have copies of an article that I did on that subject a few years back, and I think there are enough, like 20 copies if anybody wants any. I question Miami's ability to sustain any coherent collective memory in general and create places that last and focus on the needs of all of our people, which I think we should do, rather than the favored few and the ephemeral fads that flash by us. That's my kind of northeastern angry person speaking here. I hope it helps in a small way to produce a dose of realism and some dialogue in our midst rather than more negativity and a sense of futility. In fact, I have a sense of, and I'll get to it at the end of the talk, of why I'm more positive these days than I was years ago. While this is not a book about me, I did become closely involved in many of the issues surrounding Virginia Key and the struggle for waterfront public space since 1996. Virginia Key became part of a larger set of struggles for our waterfront. The oral history interviews and panel discussions that I conducted over a number of years helped me learn much. From Mabel Miller, Dante Fascell, former congressman, some of you may well remember, Athalie Range, Enid Pinckney, Lloyd Miller, Dan Paul, Johnny Winton, Arva, Merritt Steerheim, Bob Graham, and a number of others. I learned a lot. You learn a lot from talking to people. Most of the information that I found, I try to have little bits and pieces of it in the book here and there. A number of us in this room formed the Urban Environment League in the unsuccessful fight to stop the Miami Heat from taking parkland to create the American Airlines Arena in 1996, again 20 years ago. And I began to gather documents, conduct some of these oral history interviews, and become more and more involved with others. And I could not walk away from selective aspects of the politics of land development, race relations, and the shape of cultural power and the media bias surrounding us. My curiosity about the ongoing story paralleled my sense of, I guess, responsibility to use whatever skills as an historian I developed to try to bring greater context to the periodic, dramatic confrontations over the waterfront. I've tried not to paint simplistic pictures of villains in this book, nor get overly involved in various aspects of ethnic or political history, but to keep some distance from these issues, hard to do as I sought a lot of the big picture over time. Our problem, as I see it, is systemic, not personalized. I think that's important to see. I came to believe that we, white Anglos, Jews, people of African heritage, Hispanics, all of us, have civil rights to public space that are being systematically taken away by our collective lack of memory, our lack of cohesive political involvement, and our flaky local consciousness, along with weak politicians, weak media in many respects, and administrators with little memory or ability to follow through on their responsibility to the public rather than to political contributors. Public responsibility to maintain and enhance public space often seems alien to us in Miami, almost a joke over many, many years. This is a topic that I believe needs far greater attention by politicians, again, the news media and the public. The mantra of public-private partnerships, I think, also needs greater questioning in terms of how the public truly benefits. What indeed has happened to our public realm, I think, is a really very important question. My ability to define and get at the history of this story, if you will, has evolved over a long time, taken a variety of personal twists and turns, and has involved more than the usual sources. I used TV news programs, one of which was fascinating to me about Delray Beach, which you wouldn't think would have much to do with Miami and race relations and beaches, and yet, in fact, it's a fascinating document that was shown in Miami in 1956. Some of you may possibly remember that I think had a significant impact at that point. I showed up at innumerable meetings, learning not to be fearful of leading activities upon occasion, writing legislation and lobbying them pieces of legislation through the commission, while I periodically sought to step back and said, enough of this stuff, which I think you have to do in Miami, frankly, kind of almost think about the public condition and the problems of civic activism in our region, which I tried to do periodically. So I guess to some degree what I did was to walk what some might see as a thin line between subjectivity and objectivity. But I think I tried to do it without fear. I just say, tough, this is what interests me and this is what I'm doing at this point, and I'm moving forward with it. Miami's been unique as a southern city, as others have noted, south of the South. It is uniquely multicultural with a brilliant melange of people from all over the world. No one, to my knowledge, correct me, Arva, but to my knowledge, has yet detailed some of the nature of the long-term struggles for public space in Miami in much of any detail. My book is only one step in that ladder, seems to me. Many have written fine books and articles about the Everglades, like Michael Grunwald, race and ethnic relations, notably the late Ray Moll, architecture, historic preservation, Arva's book on George Merrick, and a number of others. But to this day, and I think this is important, there has never been a reasonably competent political history of this region. Never. And we all pay a high price, if it's elusive one, for our political ignorance within the complex jurisdictional matrix around us and the weak media world within which we live. I gradually became aware of this through my work early in my career here, helping to create with ARVA what's now known as the Florida Moving Image Archive, preserving local TV news, film, and later doing research on an article I wrote that I mentioned before called Playground of the USA on spectacle in American culture. I got interested also somewhat later in the impact of anti-communism down here in the 1950s, something that not many people know much about at all, and how powerful it was in retarding a lot of the civil rights movement in the early 50s, associating African Americans and Jews and communists and labor advocates and whatnot. Has a very strong impact here. Let me start and show a few slides, and I have some things that I can read from the book. It starts out with the 1945 demonstration. These are, by the way, several scholars who've done work on race relations in Miami, fairly recent time. Without going into all the titles of the books and whatnot, it's growing. I'm sorry. Can I walk around with it? Absolutely. Much better. Including the late Ray Moll, and one I will like to mention in particular, Stetson Kennedy. Stetson Kennedy died a few years ago, infiltrated the KKK during World War II, was an amazing person, a model really, I think, for a lot of people because of his bravery in dealing with civil rights issues throughout Florida. Fearless person. That's obviously an image of his book at the top. I was lucky enough to have him come and visit one of my classes a number of years ago, and so we did kind of an oral history of him in the class. So talking about land over time and the sea around us, that's a shot of Virginia Key Beach today. Some other shots. Castle, that's, somebody mentioned the castle, that's just as up, what, Gene is here. How long ago was that? About 3 months ago or so? Was it? Okay. Anyway, amazing, amazing. I just stumbled upon it. Some other shots of just people lots of times don't realize how beautiful Virginia Key is. And, you know, my concern is that it can slip away. That beauty and the natural beauty of the area can go away in a flash. I'll come back to one of my concerns about planning a little bit later. These are just some introductory shots. Some people don't know where it is and what it's about. This is Virginia Key. This is the Marine Stadium Basin, as most of you know. This is the so-called African-American historic Virginia Key Beach right in here. There's a wastewater treatment plant up in the northern part. There's a toxic dump. There's a Rusty Pelican, as most of you know there. There's basically natural areas and beach areas here, and then there's educational and research institutions in that part of the island. Bottom line to me is it's a hodgepodge as an island in terms of jurisdictions, because some parts are controlled by the county, some by the city. In terms of planning, in terms of what's there, no one lives there. So it does not have, in one sense, a constituency of inhabitants, but it has interest groups. Their biker interest groups we're just talking about in the north part, and they've created a huge constituency there. There are rowers here. So a lot of different constituencies, and yet, I don't know, the coherence of it all has been elusive for generations, I think it's safe to say. Here's another shot of the island. Let me start, I'm going to some degree chapter by chapter here with a few comments. I'd like to introduce this gentleman, Lawson Thomas. Lawson Thomas was, actually there's a courthouse named after him downtown, as some of you may well know. He was first black judge in the South, became judge in a black court in 1950. But his story is fascinating to me. I interviewed his widow, Eugenia Thomas, and she gave me a whole series of documents, his speeches from the late 1940s in particular. He was originally born in Ocala, went to Michigan, finally moved down to Miami in 1935, and his legal challenges to racism began on his first day in court, Thanksgiving 1937, when he sat in the front of the courtroom representing several defendants. The bailiff directed Thomas to sit down with the rest of the niggers. Thomas refused, ignoring the bailiff's threat to toss him through the sixth-floor window, unquote. It was a threat that Judge James E. Dunn, upon taking the bench, quickly ended, telling the bailiff that under Florida law, Thomas was entitled to sit where he pleased. Working occasionally with Thurgood Marshall, the NAACP's lawyer, Thomas won several critical cases that brought some hope of equality to African Americans in southern Florida. There are a couple of his comments, I think, that are in particular useful to think about. He was speaking at one point, 1947, in Tampa, and he was listing the unmet needs of southern blacks. He articulated the notion of a civil right to public space. He said, if there's anything upon which on its very face may be found to be generally disgraceful in the South, it is total lack of recreational facilities for Negroes. We do not know of a single adequate gymnasium for physical culture for Negro children in any public school in the state of Florida. We do know of a few so-called parks, most of which amount to no more than a baseball field, and here and there a few $100s worth of recreational facilities for small and grown-up people. It has been scientifically shown that there is a direct relation between juvenile and consequently grown-up delinquency and crime and recreational facilities which direct the spare time of human beings into proper, wholesome channels. He went on at another talk a little later with something that I think is pretty interesting to keep in mind too. Again, none of these have ever been published or anything like that, so I think this is a first. This is in Jacksonville. He said, there are considerations far more important than material wealth, inventive genius, and industrial development, which we must consider and love as Americans if our system is to be perpetuated. The basic principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are not material. They were not devised for the creation of a great material empire. Their concepts are purely moral and spiritual, and our system, our way of living, our ability to maintain the moral leadership of the world does and will depend on how we, the American people, display at home and abroad the spiritual fiber first found in the breasts of the founding fathers of our republic. I think that's kind of a nice quote. So he was the leader of the 1945 sit-in at Hallover Beach, but he didn't like to swim at the beach at all. Never did. His wife told me that. He would sometimes go out to Virginia Key Beach later, but he would just sit there, and it just didn't. A lot of African Americans couldn't swim, as presumably a lot of you know too, which became clear. The beach finally opened in August of 1945, and it was quite quickly popular, but as some of you may know, it was hard to get there. Does anybody know how you got there in the early days? By boat, essentially from, was it 5th Street, I think it was, Gene, on the Miami River. Boats would go out periodically, but it was hard to get there. However, one thing that's important to keep in mind is that African Americans did go to Virginia Key far before 1945. There's a history of a number of prominent families, in particular the Reeves family and whatnot, that would go out in the 1930s and before, take a boat out. There are also clearly examples, although it's hard to document, of escaped slaves that were living there in the 19th century. So it has a very rich history, but what I found over many, many years, and this is not revelation just to me, Miami has an incredible hidden history that we're now just beginning to kind of uncover more and more. And it's hard. Some of it's very difficult to do, to find some of that stuff. I don't mean just for me, but for anybody. I'll take some questions in a few minutes. Second chapter is called Beyond Colored Town, Shifting Boundaries of Race Relations, African American Community Life in Miami. And to some degree, it comes out of my interest with somebody I interviewed when I first came to Miami in 1983, 84, a long time ago. I interviewed an elderly gentleman. He was then in his 80s, and his name was James Nemo. And he had come from the Bahamas before World War I and served in World War I. And he came back bitter as heck at basically the way the government treated him. He eventually became a union organizer, member of the Communist Party eventually. He was involved with some serious religious disputes in the 1920s. It was a fascinating character. It kind of drew me in, the oral history that I did of him. And I interviewed a number of other people, including the local head of the something called the Civil Rights Congress in the early 1950s, who was a member, presumably, of the Communist Party. And she told me very interesting stories about her own involvement. Her name was Bobby Graff, and I have actually both of those on videotape that I think I'm putting in they may be in the university library now. There were clearly a lot of barriers. Raymond Mole has written, by 1930, most of Miami's black population of approximately 25,000 was crowded into an area, about 50 small blocks, covered over mostly with shotgun shacks and slum housing. By the 1920s, the United Negro Improvement Association, the Garvey movement, was very powerful in Miami. There are examples of hundreds and hundreds of UNI advocates marching with wooden simulated rifles as a kind of defiance against the white power structure at that point. Who knew? There was also very rich local life for African Americans, even though in great poverty, through Booker T. Washington High School, through churches, very vibrant street life, nightlife in Colored Town in particular that was so powerful. And yet, of course, African Americans were banned from what became Bayfront Park. They couldn't swim legally anywhere in Biscayne Bay. So where would they swim? They would go to rock pits, and a number were drowned over the years. There was one brief episode, and we don't know that much about it, at least I don't, when Dana Dorsey, a developer, had a beach briefly for about a year or something like that, Fisher Island, but that fell apart for various reasons in terms of transportation. And so it was not until 1945 again that theoretically African Americans could swim in Biscayne Bay. I mean, just, wrap your minds around that for a minute. Pretty amazing. However, some interviews that I did underscored that, in fact, they did. They would swim anyway. They would just sneak in. They would sneak out to Key Biscayne, for example, and go with others. So anyway, this is a picture, by the way, of the this gift, how should I put it, that white people gave to African Americans. This, what was it, acres at the time, beach. And that's a shot of the boat. That's the only one that I found. How do you get there? By that boat. So what went on at the island when people got out there? The book has a whole chapter on that with a lot of oral history materials. I don't want to read too much of that now because of time. Baptisms, barbecues, family gatherings. A lot of African Americans in particular at that beach, and it was segregated, had never spent that much time in nature. So it was, really enlightening experience in a number of ways. There was a connection also to the Hampton House, which is a major African American resort, 27th Avenue, that Enid Pinckney, these days, in the last, 10 years, has revived, brought back to a great deal of prominence. She put very dedicated to that. So there was a real relationship between the Hampton House, Virginia Key. People like Martin Luther King came frequently to Miami in the late 50s and 1960s, staying at the Hampton House, going frequently to Virginia Key Beach with friends, with singers and others who were there as well. Couple shots. That's the food concession building that's there today. and will be revived sooner or later, I think, as a great location. Some of the photographs, the older photographs, are fascinating to me because they upend a lot of people's perceptions. A lot of African Americans had nice boats in the 1950s. I mean, one might have a picture of just, misery or something like that. Donald Trump has been saying things like that. African Americans just all living in poverty. But in fact, they had boats. There's another shot. I think it's here next. Maybe. Oh, there it goes. They had overnight stays in those buildings that are now gone. So it was a place for romance, honeymoons, marriages performed there. It was building a very powerful, strong sense of community within the African American community at large. They had a mini train that mirrored the one that was out on Crandon Park that was finally created in 1947 on Key Biscayne. Carousel that's been brought back to life in recent years. The hard work of Gene Tinney, who's over here, who's chair of the Virginia Key Trust, and many others. That I think is a beautiful shot. You have a sense of the power of the natural world, the fellowship, people coming together by the sea. It had a great power on a lot of people, it seems to me. And this shot is fascinating to me. This is one of my favorites. What does that tell you? Any comments? A lot of cars. Okay. I mean, it's just a number of late model cars. I don't know, and I'm not sure whether you know the exact date of that photograph, but it's in the 50s, probably late 50s. 55, probably 57 or something, who knows, but amazing. A, how popular it was, and B, that a lot of people came by cars. I put it in very basic terms like that. That's quite something to me. I chart in the next chapter the shifting sands of civil rights in South Florida, and I use an interview that actually a student did of Garth Reeves, who is very much still alive, publisher of the Miami Times, and he came back with a sense of bitterness, I guess you could say, about what he was up to the mic thing. He said when he got back, he was a black veteran, by the way. I mean, he fought in the war, and again, he's son of the founder of Miami Times. And he said, patriotic as well as I could be, I still have something today against flying the American flag on a flagpole. I always saluted it, and I respected it, and I stood up at the Star-Spangled Banner, but in my home, I have a 25-foot flagpole on my pool deck where the boat is, and I never ran up the American flag on my pole. One time I had Mandela's flag, and one time I had the flag of the Bahamas where I was born, but there's something that always kept me from running the American flag up the pole. And you can understand that in some ways from where he came from. He went on talking about his neighborhood, and when he came back and some of the conversations that he had with his mother, because he wanted to leave Miami, get the heck out, because he was kind of disgusted with it. He said, we were still locked down in Overtown. I thought about all the good times I had in 2nd Avenue, the clubs we sent to. We had big bands come to town. People were worried so much about integration. As long as I had a fair shot at being able to enjoy myself, I don't have to be in a white person's company. But you didn't want to accept segregation. When I was in the Army, I went to a lot of places, and I came back home, and I talked to my mother. I said, I think I'm leaving town. And she said, why? I've been in a lot of big places I like better than Miami, she said. Name a few. So I said Chicago, I like New York, I like Seattle, Washington, I like New Orleans. She said, well, I'll tell you what. I want you to stay home because your father has a business here, and I think he wants you. He would be disappointed if you left home. But let me tell you, anywhere you go today in this country, you're going to find prejudice and discrimination. You might go places where you can ride in the front of the bus, go to the theater or any restaurant you want, but you will find that you'll be segregated in the same way once they see the color of your skin. I thought about that for a long time. My mother said, why run away from what you don't like? Why don't you just stay here and do something about it? So I said, what can I do? She said, you can make changes. Make changes. If you don't like it, say so. Your daddy's got a newspaper. Use that. She kindled something in my mind about using the press in order to fight your battles instead of with guns and sticks. He goes on. I guess big part of what this book tries to do is to show that in Miami, unlike some other cities, there were a great deal of negotiations that went on between African-American leaders and white leaders. In particular, the creation of the beach in 1945 came about because of long-term relationship between a number of leading black figures and Charles Crandon, the chairman of the county commission. So there's a lot of negotiations, in other words, that really have not been known. In the civil rights movement in this country in general, what does one think of when you think of the civil rights movement? You think of Birmingham bombing, you think of the March on Washington in one sense, you think of a number of conflicts in many instances. I guess what I found here is that there were some conflicts, like a demonstration on the beach, but there was a lot more that went on in the civil rights movement. And that's not as dramatic sometimes, but it was powerful, I think. So the movement, without going into too much detail here, was a lot more complex in the late 40s, 1950s, in terms of integrating, starting with the beach, but golf courses, a lot of the push for integrating schools, of course, which is well known. There was also, a lot of people don't know, there were attempts, serious attempts by state legislators and others to try to get the NAACP to go out of business by trying to get their membership lists and intimidating them and whatnot. And it's the Reverend Theodore Gibson who went to the Supreme Court, essentially, to try to make sure that this kind of harassment didn't take place, and the Supreme Court basically went along with his perspective on that. It was a major case. Also, you have Martin Luther King, and coming to the Hampton House, doing a number of important events there, including essentially doing civil disobedience training at the Hampton House, also doing an early version. Kathy Hirsch came up with at one point of the I Have a Dream speech given at the Hampton House, supposedly, which is pretty amazing. And then on April 11th, 1966, and this photograph underscores that, he announced a demonstration for Vietnam peace. He was strongly anti-war by near the end of his life. By the 1970s, also 1980s, Dorothy Fields and a number of others started the Black Archives Research and Study Center. Eventually, the Lyric Theater, and trying to bring that back so that black history and increasingly power by African Americans was taking place. You have Athley Range, who becomes a city commissioner, and others, eventually a number of others. So there were changes that were taking place. There's chapter 5 is basically called Public Land by the Sea. So it's all about the development of Virginia Key, the wastewater treatment plant, etc., some of which I've said. These are shots of George Merrick, who Arva knows tried to get essentially a bridge to go from, Miami Beach all the way down into the Keys, but was unable to do that. That's a shot of Ed Ball of the DuPont interests, who with Charles Crandon, actually it's a great story in an oral history that I saw. He was rowed out from the mainland of Miami to Key Biscayne by Charles Crandon one day, and Crandon basically tried to talk him into building a causeway out there. And the way he did that was he got a couple of coconuts and got rum in it, and he had him 2 or 3 drinks, and he agreed to it. But that was 1940, and it didn't take place for what major reason? As you can imagine, the war came. So that's why it was delayed until basically 1947, when finally that came about. So all these things, I think, are significant. Sorry, yeah, interesting. So by the 50s, Virginia Key, especially the eastern portion, what was it, the southeastern portion, becomes far more developed with a aquarium, if you will, research and pleasure, eventually NOAA and a number of other facilities that were created there. I spent some time in my book, because it actually fascinated me. I wish I could have spent more time on kind of looking at the containment of nature, is the way I see it. In other words, there's fascination of speed, spectacle. Flipper was a big deal, you know, by the early 1960s. Speedboats, Jacques Cousteau, Wild Kingdom. It's a different world in many ways. I mean, we're now far beyond that. And then by 1963, of course, the Marine Stadium was created. I spent a few pages, and I don't want to spend a lot of time here on it. It's because even back then, it's not a good story in one sense. A lot of people enjoyed it and got a great deal of pleasure from it, but economically, it didn't do well in those early days. It almost went under, and there were all sorts of schemes that were created. So it remains, I think, a major challenge in Miami of how to deal with that huge issue and how to pay for it. This is a shot at the Marine Stadium in 1972 that gets at, to some degree, the racial politics in a weird way. Sammy Davis Jr. Hugging Richard Nixon, who was clearly working hard at getting some black votes. He seemed happy, but whatever. So I don't want to take too much time because I'd rather have some questions. I spent a lot more, about half the book, going into more recent notions of placelessness and fluidity in modern America. I question our deference to tourism as the kind of single aspect that we so often bow to. The fact that in 1999 Miami had the highest poverty rate in the country, and somehow that didn't wake people up enough, as far as I'm concerned. We also, in 1999-2000, had the least amount of park space per capita of any medium-density city in the country. And that's when a number of us, actually in this room, kind of started getting more and more involved in the issues involved and say, look, these parks are going away. What can we do about it? And so that's when we started to form in 1996 the Urban Environment League. We got involved, and I have some pamphlets for the Urban Environment League here, by the way. But the other thing to understand is that in terms of Virginia Key Beach, in 1982, the county and the city, they periodically do global deals. And they had a global deal, and in part of this global deal in 1982, the park was transferred from the county to the city of Miami, okay? And you can say, well, okay, who cares? Well, it becomes significant because, page 191, there were deed restrictions in that park at that time. And the deed restrictions said explicitly that the property is restricted, this is from the county to the city, to public park purposes only, to be kept open to the public, providing maintenance and a level of service equal to or exceeding that which was provided by the county, unquote. The park was promptly shut down after it was transferred. It was used as, target practice for police in many instances. It was used for movie shoots. It was neglected. Bob Weinreb is somewhere around here, or was. Yeah. Bob and I, back in 1999, 2000, talked to a couple county officials when the park was threatened, and we said, there are deed restrictions here. When did you look at the deed restrictions? These are county officials we talked to. They basically said they've never, they were required to deal with them once a year, something like that, on a yearly basis? Right. Never had been done, okay? So these are a park that's basically set up for failure. Other people wanted to buy it out for parking lots and other stuff like that. So Miami has a sad history of all this. I can go through, and the book goes through, sadly, too much of this kind of stuff. There were heroes, and there are a few heroes in this book, Dan Paul being one of them, who stood up as a lone wolf and sued the hell out of the city upon occasion, made acerbic comments often, and had an impact on a lot of people over a long period of time. I did an oral history of him. I learned quite a bit from that, too. Carl Hyacint's work was powerful as well in a number of instances. But Miami was becoming this big city. And a lot of this is, changed. How many of you ever went to Jimbo's, just out of curiosity? Yeah, yeah. But that's like an old Miami that's just not here anymore. Everything's now kind of gleaming new. I don't know, something lost for sure there. And there was a 110-acre toxic dump in the center of the island that, by and large, is still there. There are plans from the county with money to try to remediate it coming up. But it's a major problem. It's a major cost. It's a major embarrassment. There's Bob, correct me here, a whole truck that was apparently swallowed up at one point, right? Bulldozer. And Lord knows what's still in there, in terms of all just truckloads after truckloads would go in there dumping toxic stuff. Because it was unregulated, it was unplanned, it was uncontrolled. It was a lake. Right, right. Yeah, amazing to me. So, in other words, by the late 1990s, and let me really try to stop, Virginia Key Beach was woebegone, neglected, set up in many ways for insider deals. It had been transferred, as I said, closed for essentially 2 decades, and then there was a committee formed to look into what to do with the island, and there were all sorts of schemes to use it, and a number of people, including Gene Tinney, several other people, Don DeLeon, Bob, Nancy, Blanca Mesa, sitting here, all stood up and started to organize and started to say essentially, that this should remain as a park. It should remain as a park in memory of the civil rights movement, even though it was a black segregated park. So, a little different in that sense. It's because questionable. And we went before the waterfront board of the city, made a presentation. Nancy pulled it together. Remember John Brennan, who was the chair of the waterfront board, got it mixed up with the other far more professional group and said, which plan is which? Thinking that, but it worked. Anyway, so the waterfront board voted for it. Eventually the city commission created a group to redesign the park, essentially. And eventually, oh well, there we go. Yeah, time for questions, you're right. But I have one more thing to do. The power of a lot of women in all this, I think, is important. Enid Pinckney in particular. The other thing, there's a planning charrette. There's Gary Milano is here. I had a picture of you right there. In terms of habitat restoration. And Mabel Miller. A lot of other work that people put into it. But I wanted to end essentially with my concern about Miami and this culture of spectacle and all the dazzle that we have around us that I think we need to question more effectively. And where I'm going these days, my perspective is I started something, a group for young adults with intellectual disabilities, 18 to 30 years old. It's called Nature Links for Lifelong Learning. And there, the group was, actually it was the summer before last, I think it was, at Virginia Key Beach. So the trust understood and understands to this day the connection in terms of civil rights to public space to different kinds of people. And so Nature Links kids have had gardens there. We're also have space at the Frost Science Museum, and I have pamphlets for that too. So I think I will end there so there's more time for questions. Thank you very much. Any comments or questions? Yes.
John Van Leer, when I was president of Key Biscayne, I remember one particularly outrageous cockamamie scheme was to build a World's Fair site on Virginia Key. That to me was kind of the ultimate of the spectacle and utter weirdness associated with this kind of thing. We fought it, and a bunch of people did, and it never happened. But they gave it the college try.
1982, a World Exposition, something like that. Yeah, I start one of the chapters with that. Any other questions or comments? Or Gene? I actually was going to read your, ran out of time. I was going to read a comment.
Oh, well, just a comment that needs to be made. Well, none of that would have happened if I didn't get a phone call one morning from Greg Bush, who alerted me and a few other people who were extremely busy, like Mrs. Raines and Mrs. Pinckney, that there was a plan going right, through the pipeline, through back channels, to develop this, what was it called? Eco Campground Resort. It's, $350 a night, nothing that, you guys couldn't afford, but, so in a real sense, Greg was the father of the whole movement to reclaim, restore, and reopen Virginia Key Beach to the public. So his authoring this book is not just a coincidental outgrowth of his previous work, but really kind of very appropriate, and couldn't come from a better source. So I just want to give an extra thank you to Greg for that.
Yes, sir.
John DeLeon. Listen, if we were in any other progressive town in the country, I think, this is a major book on civil rights in the community of the city of Miami. There would be a lot more of a diverse community here at the launching of the book. And I'm wondering what you account for that segregation that we have in our community still in 2016. I mean, I don't see that we've made that much progress when a major civil rights book comes out, and I see the number of people who are here who are African American are not participating in it. It's all white, majority of white middle class people. I'd like you to comment on that.
Thank you. Can I talk about nature links? I think you're right. I mean, I think ultimately that we still live in a very divided city, county, with all sorts of pockets where we're all divided from each other. What I guess from my perspective is jaded in some ways. What brings us together oftentimes are major sports events. And to me, I'm not a major commercial sports guy, just for information. That's very sad, and I had if I can find this, I had a kind of a mini debate with Tom Fiedler a number of years ago over the baseball stadium, because if I can find this quote, I think it's pretty significant. If I can find it. Anyway, essentially what I was saying was that a stadium crowd is not the community, and to have that kind of false sense of consensus is really damaging to the community as far as I'm concerned. That in fact we have this rich panoply of people, communities, et cetera, but we don't, for the most part, the media doesn't see it that way. We're focused on these kind of big events, and I think that's a mistake. I mean, not to say that sports are bad, not to say that professional baseball is even bad. That's not the issue, but we get so off the track, as far as I'm concerned, by focusing on stadium issues and stuff like that, that we lose sight of a lot more very important things. And I think the community remains fragmented in large part because of the lack of nuanced focus. If that helps answer. Yes.
The one stadium which did have great cultural significance, we tore down. The Orange Bowl had deep Cuban roots. It had deep black roots. It was the place where the black athletes were finally integrated into the University of Miami program of football and essentially achieved greatness in some respects. And so what did we do? We took this place where all the good stuff happened and we tore it down to make some big commercial whatever. Yeah.
Taxpayer money. So I guess I see a lot of these issues as intertwined. I mean, the end of my book is more, is less about race relations, frankly, than about these other bigger issues of culture of spectacle and whatnot. And I think that fits to me. Other questions, comments? What happened to Del Rey? It was, I'm sorry if I didn't explain it. It was basically an issue in 1956 over African Americans being kept from swimming pool and beach. And what happened is really an interesting story, is that, 1956, is that there was stuff in the Miami Herald about it, so there were articles in it, but eventually Ralph Rennick, WTVJ, newsman, very famous down here for a long time, took a film crew up to Delray Beach and got African Americans and whites together, the kind of leading white politicos together in a room, and with cameras whirring, worked out a deal where they were allowed access. In other words, it's a pressure. I saw this as an important document, still do. It's the pressure of the camera enforcing negotiations, if you will. And in fact, it worked, but even more significantly, it seems to me, is it was broadcast all around South Florida. So what impact would that have? In other words, Mitchell Wolfson, who's head of WTVJ at the point, obviously was behind that, probably Hank Meyer and whatnot, who was a good friend of his. So in other words, some of Miami's leaders, maybe more liberal leaders or whatever, were behind, did not want, riots, because that's bad for tourism. So they wanted to be able to work that out, and they used television to be able to do that. It was actually, I think it's a very significant broadcast. Somebody else? Blanca had a question.
Okay, I just wanted to see if you could kind of bring us up to date of what's happening right now in Virginia Key, and what do you think is going to happen next with the island, because a lot of it is really sort of the same way it's been for for decades. It's not really developed or anything. Yep. So.
Well, yeah, I didn't finish here for obvious time reasons, so I'm ready to bring me back. In 2010, after the input of, some of you may probably know this, hundreds of people ultimately, there was a master plan that was created for Virginia Key. There was an upending of the city's master plan, and the public master plan was passed unanimously by the city commission. And it called for an advisory board or an oversight board for the entire island, sustainable transportation, preserving the stadium, a whole bunch of things. The oversight board was never created by the city until January of this year. So in other words, the city didn't follow its own master plan at all. And so my perspective, all sorts of bad things happen without that kind of oversight, including the boat show. People are going to disagree on that for obvious reasons, but and asphalt all around the Marine Stadium and things like that. To his credit, Francis Suarez, commissioner, worked with a number of us, Gary and Grace Solares and the Urban Environment League, and pulled us together, and we wrote the legislation to put the Virginia Key Advisory Board, to create it, essentially. And then the City Commission passed it unanimously. So the political moment had passed because, to be honest, Commissioner Sarnoff did not want to see it happen. I think that's safe to say. And they deferred to him because it was his district. So it's now in existence. I chair it, but there are all sorts of problems remaining. Gary's on it too. Actually, Blanca is too. This, I guess, is a publicly noticed meeting or something like that. And there are a lot of challenges in relation to it. We're trying to get a workshop together to bring a lot of people back to discuss the master plan and sequencing, including Marine Stadium. There's supposed to be a maritime center. I mean, there's a kind of complex set of issues. But in my view, if you leave it to to the planning department of the city of Miami and some other city leaders, you're going to get endless commercialization, which is not what the public wanted. So people have to remain vigilant. That's the bottom line. And be aware of these things. We're going to have hopefully a public meeting or two and get people out and express themselves. You're on it too. I'm sorry. Yes, sir. Yes. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Liz Hernandez, and I'm with a group of volunteers that's been working for many years on Virginia Key to restore the natural habitat. It's a group called Tree Mendes Miami, TREE. We've planted over 11,000 trees and shrubs to try to bring it back to its former glory out of respect to the historical nature. And now that we're here all together, I want to invite everyone who's in this room and listening to please join us. We're not making a penny. We're doing it as a labor of love. And we need help. And we plant trees that are native, and we remove invasives, and we do maintenance work. So we need a lot of hands out there, and we'd welcome everyone here. And calendars at Tree, T-R-E-E, treemendesmiami.com.
Very good. Thank you very much. Anybody else? A final question? We probably need to. Yes, sir. Okay.
Is there a possibility of the government applying it and putting it into part of the national park, having a historical museum, that sort of thing? Because of the connection,
Yeah, I did a study, I mentioned this here, in 2006 for the National Park Service. That's what got me involved in all this stuff in one level. And they said no. I think it's possible. I know Blanca's pushing for it. I think it's safe to say. And I think I'd like to see it. I'd like to see it. Problem is going to be, the city is probably not, and I'm sure there are other people in this room will say, the city will never do it, you know, period. Probably, but, you know, it depends on political will of the people also, and the pressure of people. All this stuff is political. That's kind of the thing that I learned, you know, through. Yeah. Yes.
Someone told me, and I can't remember his name, he has a plan to talk to President Obama on his way out.
Uh-huh.
Because he has some discretionary money to use. The idea is that he would buy the island and preserve it as a historical civil rights place.
Or even you can use parts of it as, I mean, and I think one of the proposals has been, which I tend to like, would be to include the Miami Circle and the historic Virginia Key Beach Park, possibly the Marine Stadium, so several places that would make more of an integrated waterfront path, if you will, or site that could be brought together rather than necessarily the whole island. But I don't know what's doable, to be honest, politically. Yes, Nancy. Yeah, that's a very sad development too. I mean, it fits a lot of the stuff that we've kind of been talking about. And then even some of us were involved too with the north part of, you know, the so-called Tequesta ruins. You know, was it MDM Corporation putting this huge building up that was where the Royal Palm Hotel was, and maybe a bigger Miami Circle site, and it's basically all been eviscerated. I'm, you know, ashamed of Miami for that behavior. Yes.
Are you guys involved in any way with the FIU that came and had a great presentation with the kids about the development of Virginia Beach? It was wonderful.
When was that?
It was a few months ago. I can't recall exactly the time. And when was it? Yeah, right there at the Cork.
I was not, for whatever reason.
Fantastic. The kids were
Great.
amazing. They had the best ideas. And I don't know if it really did go into a grant or not, but it was an amazing,
Wonderful.
You know, thought about the whole thing, how they can make it so efficient,
Mhm.
clean up the beach. It was just an amazing, you know.
Do you know who led the effort that I could get in touch with, or some others? If anybody else knows, let me know.
Maybe somebody knows, but we came and it was just an amazing. Yeah.
Architecture?
Yeah.
Okay.
And, you know, that might be something that would be helpful to the country, because it
Uh-huh. One of the things that I've discovered over many, many years is you got to be persistent in stuff, but you also got to communicate. In other words, what you're getting at is, gee, I didn't know about that, you know, and that we all need to communicate better to be able to save these places, as far as I'm concerned. So when we hear it, getting networks together better, I think, is really important. Yeah, I understand. And yes, I'm sure we have to. Yes, last question. Yes. What do you mean? Right. Yeah, used to. Uh-huh. 27th and 40. Does anybody know Hampton? 40? Yeah, it's a ways up, but it's an amazing testament, it seems to me, to the persistence, again, of Enid Pinckney, who is a major preservationist, and others working with her to save the place and bring meaning to the neighborhood and to the black experience, if you will, in Miami. So she's great. Anyway, thank you all very much for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Professor Bush. Folks, the books are for sale behind the counter. If as you rise, you could fold your chairs, it'll create some room in the room so we can get the autographing done over here. If you're watching online, give us a call. We'll get you a book. Thanks so much for coming.